All right, hi everyone. My name is Margie Ring. I'm the State Solid Waste Engineering Coordinator with the Materials Management Division of the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. Next slide, please. Today I'm going to talk about construction and demolition waste landfill requirements and other solid waste requirements for handling of such waste. So first, a little introduction to the landfilling requirements. Any construction and demolition waste landfill is limited to only construction and demolition waste, which includes building materials and packaging and rubble from construction, remodeling, repair, or demolition of structures, whether it's homes, businesses, industrial. Can all go into a C&D landfill, but C&D waste does not include asbestos waste, household waste, corrugated cardboard, appliances, drums and containers, or tanks and piping, except for septic tank systems. So we only have a few C&D landfills in Michigan because the waste streams are so limited, and the siting criteria and requirements for the landfill are fairly stringent. We only have currently 4 construction and demolition waste landfills in Michigan. 2 of those do not accept commercial waste. They're only for the owner of the landfill to put their waste in. And the other 2 are construction demolition waste and industrial waste landfills. So if someone wanted to site a construction and demolition waste landfill, they'd have to meet many of the same siting criteria as a municipal solid waste landfill. They'd have to have leachate collection and control systems, groundwater monitoring, a lot of the operational requirements like daily and interim cover. And the primary difference between a municipal solid waste landfill and a construction and demolition waste landfill has to do with groundwater isolation distance and financial assurance. And because the waste streams are so restrictive, we tend not to see too many C&D landfills. So there's a difference in liner design, a somewhat less stringent liner design, but it still requires a flexible membrane or clay liner system. So next slide, please. Okay, so getting away from landfill disposal of construction and demolition waste landfill, we have a number of exemptions from the definition of solid waste. So if you meet these exemptions, the waste does not have to go to a landfill for disposal. So we have the site and source separated materials exemptions. Site separated materials are materials separated from solid waste for the purposes of recycling or reuse. And this is taken to a location where the separating happens. If you have more than 10% waste that comes out of it, that's considered processing, and we'll discuss that in a minute. Source separated materials are where you do the sorting at the site of generation, and then you haul it off once you've separated it into the different material streams. And there's some requirements that you not speculatively accumulate these materials, which means you have to move the waste out or the materials out within a year of accumulation, unless you're recycling at least 75% of the material stream each year. So if you meet these definitions, it's no longer considered a solid waste. Next slide, please. Okay, so other ways of handling construction and demolition waste are taking it through a transfer station or a processing plant. Transfer stations are facilities used to rehandle or store waste before it's transported, just as the name implies. So bring in a small truck, you repackage the material into a larger truck, haul it off to a landfill or somewhere else for handling and disposal. Processing plants, you're actually physically working with the material, separating out reusable material for recycling or reuse, and then the waste portion of it goes off for disposal. That materials that can't be recycled. If you're subject to these requirements, you may require a permit or a license under state law. In this case, Part 115, Solid Waste Management of the Natural Resources and Environmental Protection Act. Next slide. Okay, so the exemptions to the permitting requirements for transfer stations and processing facilities include, for a transfer station, if you're handling less than 200 yards of uncompacted waste a day, you don't have to get a permit or license, or if your facility is not designed to accept material from mechanically unloaded vehicles like a compactor truck, something like that. However, even if you're exempt, you're subject to county solid waste management plans, which govern solid waste activities within your county. Processing facilities that handle only scrap metal or separate less than 10% solid waste from the source separated materials coming in or are part of an industrial operation are also exempt from the permitting and licensing requirements of state law. Next slide, please. So we have some other exemptions that may be appropriate when dealing with construction and demolition waste if they're uncontaminated materials. So we consider construction brick, masonry, pavement, broken concrete that is reused for fill or riprap or other construction to be an exempt material, soil and rock, tree stumps and land clearing debris if they're properly handled. So you can't take materials and place them in a wetland, dispose them on somebody's property without their permission, and they can't be contaminated, for instance, with leaded paint or maybe some staining from oil or such. Otherwise, these materials are also exempt from regulation as a solid waste. Next slide, please. Okay, so that covers the basics of handling of construction and demolition waste in Michigan. And next up would be Fred Sellers, our district supervisor in the Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids Materials Management Division.
So I'm Fred Sellers, district supervisor for Kalamazoo and Grand Rapids district offices for the Materials Management Division of Eagle. Next slide. So I just want to talk about a couple of things to avoid. Margie talked about siting a facility and the things that you need to look into when setting up a facility where you're going to be recycling. And one of the things that's key is you want to make sure that you're involving the local community. You don't want to site a facility without having them involved because it will lead to negative impact from the community. You don't want the negative headlines. Another thing, and I'll show some pictures in a little bit, you don't want to be speculatively accumulating materials. You don't want endless piles of materials accumulating on site without the materials having some place for them to go. And that leads to the next bullet is you don't want to be operating without multiple outlets for materials because when what you will find typically is markets tend to dry up, and specifically a couple of my examples or most of my examples revolve around shingle recycling, and that is pretty sensitive to oil prices and whether or not those materials have any value outside of roofing materials. And you want to avoid operating without a plan. You want to have a good plan for the materials that come onto site, how they're going to be stored, how are you going to prevent runoff from stormwater events and that sort of thing. You want to be a good neighbor, and you want things to be organized, and you want things to move smoothly out there. And then the last thing to avoid is avoid creating an attractive nuisance. You'll see again in some of the slides, when you set up something, if it looks like a dump, it will draw others to dump there, and you'll end up getting other materials that you don't want to have to deal with. Next slide, please. So, like I said, shingle recycling is one that is been something I've dealt with quite extensively. And if you look at the photo on the lower left is a site, it's in Grand Rapids. And you can see there's in the northwest corner, you can see that there's a building there. And they didn't have a very good plan. They kept bringing shingles onto the site, but their markets dried up. and contracts were voided, and they eventually had to go into a lawsuit with the company that they were dealing with because they basically broke a contract. And the result is, 2 years later, you have the shingle pile that's on the right side there, and you see that the shingle pile has engulfed the buildings that were there. And the pile was probably 20 to 25 feet high at its highest, and it just kind of spread out over the site. So next slide, please. And so this is another shingle recycler in Kalamazoo, and you see the July 2010 photo. There's no shingles on site, and it's hard to tell from the photos because they're kind of blurry, but there is some residential housing in this area. And so, and there's also a church in the area too. So they did have fencing, and you see in the April 2017 photo that most of that area is covered with shingles, and the pile is quite large. It only took about 18 months for the shingle pile to reach that size, and it still sits there to this day without markets. And the company that did this is gone. We don't have any communication with them. They've dissolved. So next slide, please. So these are the sort of things that not very good neighbors. So this is December 2014. We were out there, and you see the fencing the gate is broken. It's hanging down there. You got stuff hanging on it, and then you can see the shingle pile in the background, the one on the right. And in the foreground of that picture, you see some tires. It's kind of a dark photo, but and that's the sort of thing. If people think that it's a dump, then they're going to bring stuff and they'll just drop it off there. You'll get mattresses and tires and all sorts of things. Next slide, please. And this is also the same facility. You can see the shingles in the background behind or above and beyond the vinyl only sign that's on the trailer. And then a couple of trailers in there which were loaded from materials that they had taken from a construction demolition site, and then brought them back to this site for hopefully eventual sorting and recycling or reuse. It never got to that point. And what the local community sees when they think of these sorts of ventures is they imagine pictures like this. They see the lean-to with the buckets and paint tins and scrap tires and stuff that are sitting there, and they don't want that in their backyard. It's NIMBY. So I mentioned earlier that we had the site in Kalamazoo, and they're trying to open a recycling center for construction demolition, and they're keeping it a little bit broader than that. But they're receiving a lot of negative press, and they didn't really do very much in the way of going out into the community and trying to let the community know what they were doing. So that's a really important feature, and I've seen this with regard to recycling centers, composting facilities. It's really important to get in there early and let people know what you're doing, and to put a good foot forward and keep that good foot forward. Be a good neighbor. That's really key. So next slide, please. So EPA has public participation guide, foundational skills for people that are going to be setting up projects, sites, and communities, get the community involved. And they have a lot of information in there, and that's something that you can work with them. They have links, all sorts of resources, and I would urge you to take advantage of these sorts of things before siting a facility.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Gedeke. I'm an environmental quality analyst. I do the asbestos NESHAP from the Detroit office for the air quality division of the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. Next slide, please. So the NESHAP regulations are basically, NESHAP is an acronym that stands for National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants. In 1973, the EPA established that asbestos is one of the hazardous air pollutants that would be regulated under the authority of the Clean Air Act. There's hundreds of other hazardous air pollutants as well. We're just going to be talking about asbestos, of course, today. There are basically two state agencies that regulate asbestos for the EPA. One is EGLE and one is MIOSHA. So I work for EGLE. A good way to remember it is that EGLE protects the environment. MIOSHA basically protects the workers. So for EGLE, the EPA delegated the Air Quality Department of EGLE to regulate the asbestos NESHAP for the state of Michigan. Commercial structures and single-family homes that are part of a large project are subject to the NESHAP regulations. We mostly do larger commercial projects and buildings, but also included are blight removal, like the city of Detroit. Blight removal is considered a large project, so that's why that is considered subject to the NESHAP. So that's why I am one of the inspectors that regulate that. MIOSHA protects the workers, and typically they do single family homes and also other structures that are subject to their regulations to protect the workers. They also do commercial structures as well. Next slide, please. So the way this works, for the NESHAP, every structure must be surveyed for the presence of asbestos. We need to know how much regulated asbestos-containing material, otherwise known as RACM, is there in each home. The threshold is 260 linear feet of pipe wrap, 160 square feet of items such as floor tile or a transite, or if it's in a big pile, 35 cubic feet. So the NESHAP has thresholds that must be met. If it's less than any of those items, then it would not be considered subject, or it would not be considered regulated. RACM, again, regulated asbestos containing material, includes three things: friable asbestos. Friable means if you can reduce it to powder using hand pressure only. So friable asbestos, as well as category 1 non-friable asbestos that has become friable. So things like packings, gaskets, vinyl floor tile or roofing. If it's in really bad condition, a lot of times these are exposed to the weather for a long time. You know, there might be a hole in the roof of a house and the floor tile is basically in little pieces now. So that has become friable. Most of the time at that point, you can pick it up and crush it between your hands and it'll turn to powder. And the other one is category 1 non-friable that will be subject to grinding, cutting, and abrading. So if you're going to demolish a house and you're going to cut floor tile off of a floor or abrade it, that's going to become friable. So that would also be considered regulated material at that point. We also have category 2 non-friable asbestos. These are like transite, for instance. It's a trade name. It's cementatious siding on a house that has a high probability of becoming crumbled, pulverized, or reduced to powder during demolition. That also would be considered RACM and would have to be removed before demolition. Next slide, please. So all RACM, all regulated material, must be properly abated before demolition activities. After it's abated, notifications must also be submitted electronically to our database online. If the RACM exceeds the thresholds and it has to be abated, a notification of intent to renovate must be submitted 10 days before any renovation activity. Renovation is basically the same as abatement. So if you need to abate a home of asbestos, that notification has to be filed 10 working days before any abatement work can be continued. If there's no regulated material or the amount is less than the thresholds, you don't need to do a notification of intent to renovate, but you would need to do a notification of intent to demolish. And again, that has the same 10 working day deadline before any demolition activities can occur. Next slide, please. So basically, to sum it all up, you have to do a survey for every home. If abatement is required, in other words, if the survey shows that the threshold is met on those thresholds that I showed earlier, those amounts, then abatement will be required, and you'll need to file a 10-day notification of intent to renovate. Then you would conduct your abatement, and then you would file another 10-day notification of intent to demolish, and then you would demolish the house or reconstruct it or take it apart for domicology purposes. If abatement is not required, in other words, if the survey shows that there is less or there's no regulated asbestos containing material, then all you have to worry about is a 10-day notification of intent to demolish, and then you can take the house apart after that 10-day deadline is met. Next slide, please. So these are some websites that you can visit. MIOSHA does lead as well as asbestos, so you can go to those websites there, and you can also go to the Health and Human Services website to look for lead regulations, and that website is also listed right there. And I think that concludes my presentation.